Welcome to a new week of Brain Warriors Way podcasts. And this week, we're going to be in the car with you. We are going to talk about driving and the brain, because it is actually one of the most common causes of stress,
for sure,
of trauma, and of things that damage your brain. And what triggered this for us is our almost 16-year-old daughter got her permit this week.
Right.
And so before I ask you about your conversation with her, I want you to ask yourself at home, what about cars or transportation has been good for your brain or bad for it? And too often the people I see, including one of our first conversations about your brain, is cars were bad.
Right.
For
There's a lot of people who
your
have trauma
brain.
around driving. So
we're going to talk about the brains of drivers. We're going to talk about things you can do while driving to keep yourself safer, and some very funny stories coming up in this week's podcast, Your Brain on Driving. So you had a conversation with the youngster who, by the way, was on this podcast.
Right.
And we got great comments.
Oh, I'm so glad.
About her. And not so good about us, but great about her.
That's funny. Yeah, she's a pretty special kid. And it's interesting. We drive up in LA a lot. So those of you who drive in Los Angeles, I understand. It takes a lot just to go to a Zen place. It's the one time that my personality just I just get really tense. We'll leave it at that, driving in my car. But we were talking about it. I was trying to point out to her just how often and how closely you have to pay attention, because we've seen so many accidents. We drive up there so often, and it's a long drive. It's can be 2 hours to get up there, and we've seen these accidents happen right in front of us, and how quickly they can happen. So as we were going to DMV, she and I were talking, and she's been nervous. She could have gotten her permit almost 6 months ago, but she's been too nervous to do it, and she just wasn't in a hurry. And so we were having this conversation. I said, you have to think about the fact that people get in the car every day and they just trust that everyone is going to do what they're supposed to do. They just trust that all the brains they are getting on the freeway with or getting on the road with are healthy. They're not thinking about the fact that the brains they are getting on the road with have PMS, menopause, they're sleep deprived, they've got PTSD, ADD, all these slew of, or they're intoxicated.
Oh no, let's keep going. Because, and I apologize if you're in the car listening to this, it's horrifying.
It's horrifying.
Because their brains with head trauma, their brains with ADD, their brains with early dementia.
Yeah.
And what horrified me when you and I talked about this, their brains on the road with late dementia.
Yeah.
And they're also brains, and the reason there are dementia brains on the road, cell phones. Because it used to be, when I first started, a common call to my practice is my mother couldn't find her way home, and I had to go find her in a parking lot somewhere, and she's crying her eyes out because now she recognized something's wrong. But now the phone will take you home.
Right.
And so people are actually being diagnosed years later with dementia because of cell phones.
And that was the point I was making to her, is don't assume, and always be ready, always be watching. You can't relax for a second. And one of the reasons that, you'll see people on their cell phones reading texts and things, and they'll say, but there's no one in front of me. You don't know what can happen in just a split second. We see it happen so often. So I was just trying to explain to her. And if you're one of those people on the road, one thing you have to think about too, when these things happen, when someone cuts you off, you might be a good driver, you might be a defensive driver, but all of a sudden you can get pretty angry. And, it brings out another side of your personality. So now you've got an angry driver because someone cut them off. And now it's just all these different dynamics that happen on the freeway. And if you've got new young drivers, they're about to drive, or some of you have people who have not been able to drive. Maybe they had, a DUI and lost their license and they're about to start driving again. And it's time to learn from their mistakes. So we just thought this would be a good topic.
So I have a patient who was an orthopedic surgeon up in San Francisco, and by accident, a 25-year-old kid cut him off on the freeway. But this was one of those surgeons who would throw things in the operating suite.
I know the type.
And when the kid cut him off, he started to chase him. And he actually chased him 8 miles west on Interstate 80 outside of Berkeley. And the kid got really upset and anxious and tried to pull off the freeway. And this doctor in his big BMW cornered him on the off-ramp. And you know how orthopedic surgeons, sometimes will put these long metal rods in your femur if you break your leg. Well, he took the metal rod and bashed in the kid's windshield. But what he didn't know is he was chasing this ADD kid, a highway patrol officer was chasing him. And he was arrested at the scene. And yes, there's the judgment.
Yes, good. So that was my kid.
I am married to the judge, the jury, and the executioner. But so he calls from jail. He calls Amen Clinics from jail, which is not uncommon for us. And he says, I think I need to see you guys right away. And my assistant came in and she was chuckling. She said, he said right away, I think that's a good idea, don't you? And when we scanned him, he had 2 things going on in his brain. So you never know about the brains of the drivers coming toward you. And he had the cingulate from hell. And what that means, the cingulate's in the middle front part of your brain. I think of it as the brain's gear shifter. It lets you go from thought to thought, move from idea to idea, be flexible, go with the flow. And his was way overactive, which what you see for people whose cingulates work too hard is they're worried, they're rigid, they're inflexible, they hate surprises. And if things don't go a certain way, they can't stand it. And they can often explode. We often see it in autistic kids, in OCD, and for this guy, it was sort of an obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And he had trouble in his left temporal lobe. And left temporal lobe, as we've talked about a lot on our show, is often associated with mood instability, irritability, dark thoughts, sometimes violent thoughts. So if you just think about, what are the dynamics of going on in his brain, is he gets surprised by the kid cutting him off, and it's a dangerous situation.
Right.
He gets surprised. He can't let it go. And then he acts out in a way. And what's interesting is the reason I saw him is I was seeing his sister.
Oh, interesting.
Who had problems with stalking.
Right.
And those kinds of things run in families.
So let me throw something else out there. Let's just say the person he was chasing had the same kind of brain and maybe had a weapon in the car. So let's just throw that out there.
Well, when these things happen, and freeway shootings, school shootings,
you don't know who you're chasing. So be careful.
You don't know. So, everybody, when somebody cuts them off on the freeway, you might think to yourself, you jerk.
Right, but let it go.
But then for me, because people cut me off, I'll often say to myself, oh, you jerk. But then I'll leave it alone because there's seriously crazy people out there. And why would I engage with them?
Yeah.
And people's personality changes when they turn the key in the ignition
So true.
or push the button. And
their personalities also change under stress. So there are some people that flight or fight thing kicks in. So I just, that happened with us one time. You say I gave you PTSD, but it's because we were attacked. But when I'm attacked, like I went crazy, and you tend to get thoughtful and quiet and that's not me. So you think I gave you PTSD. So your personality
So
changes under stress.
They don't know what happened. Now we have talked about it, but we were walking on Corona del Mar Beach on the jetty. It was nighttime, and we have this big white fluffy German Shepherd who's beautiful, and all of a sudden, 2 pit bulls dart off their leashes, fighting dogs, and attacked Aslan.
And they had a very much a gangbanger type of owner. Who was a scary looking dude. But when I get scared, I freak. I mean, I go to this crazy.
So we have a gangbanger, scary looking dude who all of a sudden
mom.
You start screaming at him.
But that freaked you out. So my point is now replace that with those of you listening and driving. Those of you listening and you're thinking about driving, think about your personality if someone challenges you, right? You could be the nicest person, you're successful. The surgeon, he's successful. But under stress, people's personality change, right? Mothers, someone threatens your child. Someone like that surgeon, you feel threatened, you've got a baby in the car, you're likely to react in a way you wouldn't normally react. So now you've got a big problem.
When we come back, we're going to begin to give you some strategies on what to do when you get frustrated in your car. If you learned anything from this podcast, post it on any of your social media sites, #BrainWarriorsWay podcast, and you can submit questions at the end of this week. We're going to answer questions. Go to brainwarriorswaypodcast.com. Leave a review, please, and then leave a question. And if we choose your question, we'll send you a signed book.
Also, if you leave us a review on iTunes, we are giving away a copy of the Brain Warriors Way cookbook. So we are giving away a book. So you can go to get that book, you can go to iTunes, leave us a review, go to our website, ask us a question, leave a question because we're answering questions, and make sure you go to brainwarriorswaypodcast.com, and there are instructions. You can leave questions there.
Stay with us.
Welcome back. We're on week 2 of Your Brain Behind the Wheel, and we are driving with you this week. So in this episode, we are going to talk about strategies to help you when you get frustrated. Before we do, we want to ask you to think about this episode, think about anything you learn that, tell us about your challenges when you're driving. Think about questions you have about driving and make sure you leave them. You can go to brainwarriorswaypodcast.com, leave your question there. There's actually instructions. You can also tag us at Tana Amen or Daniel Amen on Instagram, and we would love to hear from you. So
before we jump in, let me read one of the reviews from San Gauma. I found all the Brain Warrior podcasts today. I scrolled down and started listening. There's so much out there about these topics, but I felt like I was finally listening to the truth. I love your honesty, the way you two complement each other, and real solutions or healthy alternatives that you offer. Thank you. I look forward to listening to more so I'm informed and can help myself, my family, and friends. Tana, you are brave for sharing your story, and I'm sure you have and will continue to give others hope.
Thank you. It's very sweet.
That's really awesome.
Yeah.
So the first strategy is don't let kids drive until they're ready to drive. People don't know about the neuroscience that you're really not an adult when you were 18. If I look back to when I was 18, that was not the mindset of a fully formed brain that, my impulsivity was high and I wasn't always making the smartest decisions. I mean, it turned out okay for me, mostly after I married you, but the brain does not finish developing until you're 25. And isn't it interesting that the insurance companies knew this before neuroscientists knew this, or before society, right? Because they basically say you're an adult when you're 18, but your frontal lobes, so the front third of your brain, the most human, thoughtful part of your brain, actually doesn't finish developing until you're about 25. Yeah. And that's when insurance rates change, because that's when car accidents go down. Because the insurance companies don't have a dog in the fight. They're just like, when do I have to pay more money? And or when do I have to pay less money? And they pay less money for drivers after the age of 25. Now we know it's because their brain doesn't work right. But at 15 and a half, in most states, we're giving kids permits to drive when their brains aren't done. Mm-hmm. And my oldest daughter, Brienne, she got her permit at 15 and a half because emotionally she was 18. Her sister didn't get her permit till she was 17 and a half because emotionally she wasn't ready when she was 15 and a half.
So one of my strategies with our daughter, and we've talked about this, you and I talked about some of this and how we were going to handle it. First of all, she's super anxious and didn't want to drive. So that was actually a sign to me that she was more mature.
And do you know why she didn't want to drive?
Because she's smart.
Because she already had a chauffeur.
Well,
who was nice to her and bought her.
So that's part of it.
Drinks.
Right. So that's part of it. That's part of it. But part of it is because she's smart, she realizes the danger. And that's one of the ways that we kind of knew she'd be ready before a lot of teenagers, because she's very anxious. She worries. And we actually like that. If you're going to get behind the wheel of a car, you should be a little bit anxious. But one thing that we've talked about, it's like, and I told her this, I said, look, I'm sorry to say this, and this isn't about bribery, but if your grades, if you maintain a certain GPA and you're involved in a certain number of activities like volunteering, that's when I will know how much you can handle, number one. Number two, whether or not you have to pay for your own insurance. And she's like, what? She's like, I don't understand. And what she doesn't understand, there's a couple things with that. Number one, it tells me how dedicated she is, how focused she is. But number two, I want her spending time doing meaningful things, like she's on the Mayor's Youth Council, she's volunteering, rather than spending time playing video games and on her phone. So because that actually makes her not as good of a driver. And so we talked about that. What can we do I'd actually rather pay for part of her insurance knowing that she's doing those things versus her just sitting at home or, not doing anything meaningful and doing something that's going to affect her focus and concentration. So she pays for part of it. only part of it if she's maintaining a certain GPA and staying so busy with these meaningful activities that she doesn't have time to work a full-time job versus,
So let's help people. So when should kids get their permits? So we've already said when they're emotionally close to 18, because being behind the wheel of a 6,000-pound vehicle, it's clearly a deadly weapon. And we often talk about how suicide is the second leading cause of death in the young. Well, the number one is motor vehicle accidents. And so, and we have friends, a really close friend, who lost her daughter from a drunk driver. And so, and sometimes it's not them, it's other people. So, and sometimes you just can't help it, right? I mean, sometimes it's just bad luck or, something awful happened. Yeah. I think parents need to be their child's frontal lobe until the child is demonstrating that their frontal lobe is developing.
Right.
It's a life or death issue. And it's different than when you were growing up. So when I got my license, I guess it was 1969, we didn't have cell phones.
Right.
Now, we did have 8-track tapes, so that's how old I am. But even when you got your license, which was what?
There were no cell phones.
There were not the level of distractions there are now. Now people put their phones in their lap and watch Netflix while they're driving, or they're texting, or they're answering emails. And it's more dangerous now than ever before.
No, I totally agree with you. And that was why it wasn't that I was trying to bribe her. It's that if I want to see how focused she is. And so, just because she's 16, just because a child is 16 doesn't mean that they should be driving. It's not like a God-given right? It's just, yes, that's the law says they can, doesn't mean they should be. So for me, it's a matter of how focused are you? How dedicated are you to certain things? And if it means that she gets good grades and stays focused, okay, it's a bonus.
You're directing her. You're being her frontal lobes.
Right.
Now, let's take a minute and talk about the other end of life. Because I've had this issue in my family. I'm one of 7 children. And sometimes, especially when my dad was sick about 5 years ago, he had heart failure and a heart arrhythmia, and they had mold in their house. I had my siblings come up to me and they go, "You have to take Dad's driver's license from him."
Good luck with that.
And like, well, let me think about this and how I can give a thoughtful response, because I'm the physician in the family.
I just know your dad.
And my first thing was, let's get his brain right, which we did, and he's better, and now he drives a lot. But if you have an older person you're worried about, so Tana, I'm giving you clues on how to deal with me 20 years from now.
Yeah, I'm thinking that's
if
not gonna be the
you
case.
have an older person you're concerned about, this is actually why the DMV exists.
Right.
And so I told my siblings, I said, I'm not going to be able to take his driver's license for me. I could take his keys, I could take his car, and he's got enough money, he'll just buy one tomorrow. Right. And, I'm not going to get him declared mentally incompetent, right? But the DMV actually thinks about this and the Department of Motor Vehicles is concerned about it. And I told my siblings that if we're really concerned, that I will call them. And one of my sisters got mad at me because we had a fight about something else. She told Dad that I was going to do that. And he got mad at me. And I told him, in the most loving way possible, if I think you're dangerous, I'm calling the DMV because I love you. And if you don't like it, it's too bad, because that's what I'm doing. And so you always want to be firm and kind at the same time. And, he got mad at me, and it's all okay. Because if I think he's dangerous, that's not only harmful to him.
Right.
It's harmful.
What about the lady with
to
the two
other
kids? Right.
people,
Or your mother in the car.
And we need to be thoughtful and careful. These are life and death decisions.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree. We got to be thinking about the other people. I have a very dear friend, someone very special to me, who's a mentor, and he had a heart arrhythmia. It wasn't even an issue of memory. He had a heart arrhythmia, and he doesn't remember blacking out for just a split second. And he ran into a woman with two kids in the car, and thank God they were okay. But he was just horrified. So if it all sounds fine, like, no, I'm going to fight to keep my license. But when you end up in that situation where you hit someone and you hurt someone, and as a trauma nurse, I saw this happen all the time. When that person on the other end is, really hurt or dies, you're going to feel very different about it.
Well, and how you fight to keep your license, how you fight to keep your independence, is you become a brain warrior. Mm-hmm. You fight to keep the health of your brain as vibrant and as sharp for as long as possible. And make no mistake, you're in a war for the health of your brain. And we're talking about one of the battlefields, which is the freeways here in Southern California. Or I just talked to our CFO who lives in Boston, and they're the worst drivers in the whole country.
They are funny, though. They're very colorful.
I don't know why they're the worst drivers, but they are. New York's not far behind. All right. When we come back, we're going to give you some more tips about how not to be stressed out when you're driving.
Don't forget about the book giveaway. So there are a couple ways you can win. You can enter in the weekly drawing for our free cookbook. It's the Brain Warriors Way cookbook. You can leave a positive review on iTunes. You can go to our website and ask us your question. There's step-by-step directions there. So go to brainwarriorswaypodcast.com and visit our review page on that website. Thank you.
And if you learned something, like how to deal with your teenager or your adult or your older adult parent, write it down and post it on some of your social media sites and hashtag Brain Warriors Way Podcast. We'd be so grateful. Welcome back. Thanks for being with us on Driving Week, Driving and the Brain Week. We've talked about young drivers and how important it is to be thoughtful and careful with them. Also, along that line, they need to be in safe vehicles.
Yes, for sure.
So let's chat about that for a little bit. We talked about older drivers and what to do when you're concerned. In this podcast, we're going to talk about other drivers,
right,
and also give you some techniques on how you can take care of your brain and calm yourself when that may not be your strength.
I actually have a funny tip on this one. Okay.
So think about what you can learn in this podcast. Pay attention to that, how it affects you. Do you have a funny story or a powerful story you can share with us? You can also enter the raffle for the drawing for one of our free books, the Brain Warriors Way cookbook that Tana will sign for you. You do that by leaving a question, a comment, or a review at brainwarriorswaypodcast.com or leaving it on iTunes.
And one thing I would encourage you guys to leave as well, besides your questions and comments, is think about, there's so many people who have been traumatized This is something we just hear so much about. I mean, our friends who have lost children from motor vehicle accidents. I have a sister who was in 19 car accidents, so my nieces, have had trouble with that. I certainly was traumatized, by people in my family driving either while intoxicated or, certain circumstances.
Falling asleep.
Falling asleep at the wheel. And as a trauma nurse, I saw it all the time. Different situations that would occur in cars. Some of them were just crazy accidents, just bizarre accidents. So think about if you know someone or you've been in a situation that you were really traumatized. You can send us, a question or a concern you've had about that. We would love to hear from you. So think about that during this episode. So I want to read a testimonial. Today I found out my iPhone had your podcasts. I heard about the podcast and by accident I found them. Now I'm going to be addicted to listening to Dr. Amen and Tana's interesting podcasts. Thank you for trying to make us all healthy. By Dr. Donald. Thank you.
So I love addicted
I know,
to
yeah.
good things.
Yes.
So I had a session today with one of my favorite patients, and she was talking about cheap hits of happy versus great hits of happy.
Oh, I like that.
So I taught her about dopamine, the basal ganglia, where cocaine works in the brain. But as she's getting healthy, she's beginning to notice what really wears out her pleasure centers, what gives her cheap hits of happiness. So think cocaine,
Right.
but also think television.
Yeah.
And marijuana and alcohol, gossiping, social media, shopping, sex with the wrong people. And she goes, great hits of happiness, time with people who lift me up, being with healthy people, reading, learning, talking to smart people, exercise, traveling. So she's beginning, and we plant these words I want you to have in your head. Does it fit? Mm-hmm. Does it fit? Does what I'm going to do now, does it fit with the goals I have for my life? And so I just wanted to share this with our Brain Warriors audience. Are you going after cheap thrills or thrills that actually make you thrilled for the long run?
Right.
And that's our goal with you. All right. Back to driving. Mm-hmm. And, we only have about 10 minutes left to talk about driving. And I remember when I met you, and I've told this story before, but I really liked you. After our first lunch.
They're probably tired of hearing about it.
I really liked you. But I had to see your brain because I didn't want to like you if you had a troubled brain. And so about 2.5 weeks after we met, I invited you to the clinic. I said, hey, you haven't seen the clinic yet. Do you want to see the clinic? And you came, and I offered you a scan, and you took it because you really wanted to learn more about our work. And you had a beautiful brain. I mean, obviously, you're still here. And you can tolerate me. But it was really clear on the left side that it had been hurt. And I'm like, did you ever have a head injury? And you looked at me like I was the craziest SOB on the planet.
Neurosurgical ICU nurse.
No. And I went, are you sure? And she said, I don't think so. I said, have you ever fallen out of a tree, fell off a fence, dove into a shallow pool? No. Have you ever been in a car accident? No. And then you stopped.
But I still didn't think it counted because I didn't lose consciousness.
Right. But tell everybody what happened.
So my sister fell asleep at the wheel going 75 miles an hour, and she rolled 2.5 times. And my head, thank God I was laying back, but my head hit the center console. But I walked away, so I felt so grateful that I thought it was all fine. Except
your brain is the consistency of soft butter. Your skull is really hard with multiple sharp bony ridges. So imagine this brain, your brain, beautiful brain, soft in a hard skull with sharp bony ridges, going 75 miles an hour. And all of a sudden she goes off the road. The car flips 2.5 times and then stops.
And skids.
What do you think is going on inside your skull.
It's like shaken baby syndrome.
Shaken baby syndrome. And even though you might notice it right away, it puts you at risk for depression later on, for irritability, for having more trouble dealing with stupid people on the road.
That is one of my issues. Yeah, I have trouble dealing with stupid people on the road. Thank God I have enough forethought that I keep it inside the car. But I don't use hand gestures. But it annoys me.
And another secret is, did you know that sleepy drivers
it's worse than
cause
drinking.
more deaths
I do.
than drunk drivers?
I do.
And so if you didn't get a good night's sleep, you should have somebody else drive you or take Uber. But there really should be an app on how much sleep the Uber driver got.
I agree. That's one of the reasons I quit working nights as a nurse, because I found myself falling asleep driving home. I'm like, nope, done. Between that and eating bad food to stay awake all night, I'm like, I can't do this. Is just killing me, literally killing me. So.
Okay, so when you get in the car, be aware. That's one of the most important things to do.
And one of the things we said we were going to talk about was drivers in your family, not the very, very young and not the very, very old. But have you been traumatized by a situation, whether it's yourself, maybe you've had a DUI, maybe you were hit by someone, but do you have a situation in your family that's traumatized you? So we have a situation, someone in our family who we have been helping, who does not have a good driving record and is now thinking about getting a license again and wants us to help. And this person had a DUI and totaled a car after we helped with that car. And I have a lot of trauma around it. I have a lot of past history and trauma around it. So at first I just felt like my automatic reaction, which is frequently this way when I'm under stress, no, like we're not doing this and not going to do this again. But that's not the most helpful thing, right? So we talked a lot about it. And the solution that we came up with and that I really thought would be the best was for us to do some EMDR together.
So you're going to get therapy together?
Yes, some EMDR therapy too. Because I have trauma around her driving. I have trauma around her putting her kids in the car and her being in the car. And I won't help with that until I'm not going to contribute to that until I have dealt with that trauma with her.
So it's very much like the 15-and-a-half-year-old is that you don't really get to drive until
I know.
Emotionally, you show the responsibility of an adult.
Yes. And my gift to her is going to be defensive driving lessons. She has to show that she can do that.
Yeah, that's very thoughtful. All right. So before we run out of time, tips. When you're in the car, first thing is decrease the distractions because you don't know the health of the brains around you. And I did a study on normal, and here's my criteria for normal. No psychiatric illness, none in your family, no head injuries, no drug abuse, and you're not on any medication. I had to screen 3,000 people to find 100 scans.
Yeah.
And so there are not that many normal people out on the road.
Right.
So let's just own it. So you need to be paying attention and give a little bit more space, give a little bit more grace, and space and grace.
I like that.
Is really important on the road.
One thing that this is just a tip that might help you, might not be. You can pick your own kind of music if you want, but it was so funny. So because we drive to LA so often, and my daughter doesn't like it when I grit my teeth and I'm grumbling, and I get so annoyed. I mean, we've had so many accidents happen in front of us, and people just drive so terribly, and they're so aggressive, and it annoys me because it's dangerous. And so she hates when I grumble on the road because she's just this little bubbly thing, and so she just starts playing Christian music in the car. And I'm like, that's just mean. That's mean. Because now I feel guilty, right? But it worked. Like all of a sudden I did not feel so angry and stressed out. And I'm like, how can you be leaking negativity when she's playing this music? It was really funny, actually.
So I've actually treated many people through the years who had driving phobias. because they got into an accident or they almost got into an accident and it triggered a panic attack. And so every time they thought of driving, it actually triggered a panic response in them. EMDR is very helpful, especially to deal with single incident traumas, because the longer you allow the anxiety to prevent you from driving, and I fully own we've increased your anxiety today about driving. The longer you increase you don't deal with the anxiety about driving, the more the anxiety will control you.
I don't think we're trying to decrease their anxiety. We want you to have appropriate anxiety. We want you to have appropriate anxiety, but not the kind of anxiety that's debilitating, right?
Right.
So,
all right. When we come back, we're going to answer your questions that you've already submitted. If you want to be entered into drawing for Tana's cookbook, the Brain Warriors Way cookbook, which is amazing. All of the recipes are gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar, really limited sugar, corn-free and soy-free. I mean, it's really amazing what you've done with this book, and they taste great.
And they're, you can, a lot of them, there's a lot of vegan recipes in there as well, but you can interchange them. They're made to be adaptable for cavemen and vegans. Don't have a dog in that fight. So we just want you to be healthy.
If you learned something today, please post it on any of your social media sites and hashtag Brain Warriors Way podcast. If you like this podcast, and we're here working, hoping you do, subscribe to the Brain Warriors Way podcast. Also, leave a review, question at brainwarriorswaypodcast.com. Stay with us.
Welcome back. In today's episode, we are going to answer your questions. So please keep sending us questions. You can go to brainwarriorswaypodcast.com and visit our review page. You can leave us a review, and you can also leave us questions. And that will also enter you in a raffle to get a free cookbook, the Brain Warriors Way cookbook. So we're going to answer your questions today.
Well, I'm so excited about it, and I was going to read a review until I had two things happen when I went to the bathroom
do we want to know this?
I just had to share. And the first one, I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, you can. I got a text from my father, a screenshot
that's so funny.
of
I know what that
3 minutes, 35 seconds. And that's all the screenshot was. And I know exactly what it meant.
Me too.
It meant he just finished, he's 90 years old, a plank where he did 3 minutes and 35 seconds.
I knew what that was.
And yesterday I got one where he did 3 minutes and 6 seconds. And what it is, he's bragging.
Yeah. He's competing with you.
He's competing with me. So now I have to go home and do one and try it. Just do a plank for 3 minutes and 35 seconds and see how you feel.
Right.
But the other thing, so this like warmed my heart. And then I walk out of the bathroom and here in Costa Mesa, there's a 12-year-old girl and she's crying. And so I just, went up to her and said, hey. And the mom got all excited, to meet me. And she had just seen her scan. And it was working too hard.
Aww.
And she was so sad. And I know many of you out there, you listen to us, you go, oh, I want to come get a scan. No, I don't really want a scan. I don't want to know. It's going to be terrible. And it'll be bad news. And I looked at her and I said, your scan is really good news because you have what you have. It's sort of like you have a car engine in your head and it's like a Ferrari and it works way too hard. So it's not tuned right. What we're going to do is tune it so that you can be happier. And I said, it's not bad news. It's really good news. And your job is to be a good reporter on what Dr. Darmal does that works for you and what doesn't work for you. So together we'll balance your brain. And isn't that cool? And then I said, and oh, by the way, you're normal. I said, I actually did a study of normal, and I had to screen 3,000 people to find 100 normal brains. So that's scary, right? When you think of driving week, this is not good news.
That's really cute.
But
I like
isn't that fun?
Yeah, that's really cute.
All right, we have questions.
I like the way you described that. Okay, so this question is from Randall. Say you find yourself in a class or at a job that is not anything you know or know you are good at, and the teacher of the class or the boss of the job says that's where you belong. Do you argue with that boss or teacher even the thought of it? Why or why not? What do you do instead? I don't want to do something for a living that is not something that is going to cause me not to learn anything new, even though it feels like anybody could do my job and my brain feels like it may not be getting stimulated enough while doing it.
People who are in jobs that do not require lifelong learning, continual learning, have a higher incidence of dementia. Now, if someone told me I needed to fix cars for a living, that is not my aptitude.
Right.
My aptitude is in writing, it's in speaking, it's in communication, it's in healing. Mm-hmm. I would break cars. I know that. I just know me. Like if I was a surgeon, that's not my, right. My parietal lobes, the spatial part of my brain is not as healthy as it could be, right. But the language part of my brain is really healthy, right? So if I'm in a job where I fail constantly because it's not my aptitude, I'm going to have chronic self-esteem right. problems and be anxious and stress.
So that's a complicated one because the boss hired you to do a job. So I think you should probably assess that going in. Both of you should assess going in. I think your boss needs to be clear what he's hiring someone for, and you should be pretty clear about whether you want to do that particular job or not, and to be clear with yourself about what it is you do want to do. There are classes now and tests you can take to help you figure out what your aptitude is. Even in college, they have this. You can learn, you can figure out what it is that you do find stimulating, that you want to do long term, or at least until you change your mind. So because once a boss does hire you to do a job, he's hired you for that.
And it's not just about what you want.
Right.
It's about what fits.
Right.
If I wanted to be center for the Los Angeles Lakers, it doesn't matter. It doesn't fit. It's not happening.
Right.
So it's like relationships. Like we fit
right.
really well together, and I'm grateful for you because of that. I don't fit well with other people.
Right.
And there are jobs I fit with. This is one. And there are other jobs I completely would be unhappy with because I wouldn't be able to excel at it.
Right.
So you want to know your desire, but you need to also mix it with your aptitude and whether or not you can mix those two things and support your family. Because that's another important thing if, like most people, you need to earn a living.
Yeah, no, I like that. So, yeah, I'd say be clear and make sure your boss is clear when you go in. One thing I do when I'm interviewing people is I have a job description there ready to go. So, and I actually have them sign it. So I think a lot of employers do that. It's really important that you know what you're getting into. So, because it's important to both of you. It's expensive for the employer to also have to find someone new. So I think that's important. Okay, next one. According to conventional medicine, psychiatry, too much dopamine gives psychosis. What do you think of that?
That's a very simplistic view of psychosis. Is there actually many things that cause psychosis? Now, when you get too much dopamine, say, for example, you become a meth addict and that wears out your dopamine centers, it dumps dopamine, just like cocaine, that you bet you can become psychotic. But there are other ways to become psychotic. For example, being exposed to Lyme disease has been associated with schizophrenia. having mold toxicity, having heavy metal toxicity. So mercury
Yeah.
poisoning and the Mad Hatter syndrome
interesting.
is been associated with psychosis. So it's not as simplistic in my new book that we're working on, The End of Mental Illness. There's a whole section on infections causing mental illness, toxins causing mental illness, sleep deprivation.
Oh,
One of the
yeah.
most common things
Yeah.
when I was an Army psychiatrist, I was the chief psychiatrist at Fort Irwin. And the big deal at Fort Irwin, which is 40 miles north of Barstow, was we trained our tank divisions to fight the Russians in the desert and later the Iraqis and Afghanis in the desert. And people would play war games for days, and they would be up 2 days at a time, and all of a sudden they're hallucinating,
Right.
or they're delusional, and they don't need dopamine blockers.
Right.
What they need is sleep.
Right. So I have a question on this to add to this question. What if people are taking the antidepressants that help them to increase dopamine, or they're taking certain medications for ADD that's increasing dopamine, and they want to back down off of that, and they've been getting a certain level of dopamine, but maybe they don't feel quite right.
So remember
hard is
when
that?
we talked about cheap hits of happy and great hits of happy? It's making sure your lifestyle is helping to balance the dopamine centers in your brain. And then if you've been used to Wellbutrin, for example, which increases dopamine in the brain, antidepressant, great antidepressant, and you've been on it for 10 years, you want to go off of it very slowly, almost like 10% a month.
And that
Just
your brain will
to
adjust.
and at the same time, you want to be making sure you're taking care of your dopamine centers, that like pumpkin seeds and green tea and magnesium and sunlight and oregano all increase dopamine naturally in the brain. And one of the illnesses where there's a dopamine deficit is Parkinson's disease, where the dopamine cells in an area of the basal ganglia die, literally, and then you can't control your muscle movements because dopamine's heavily involved in controlling smooth motor movements. Many people, the only thing they do is get on medication to enhance dopamine, and they don't do anything else. They don't do any lifestyle interventions. They don't change their diet. They don't exercise more. They don't get rid of any infections, toxins. And I just think that's an insane way to practice. If your brain is dying, you should think of it as an emergency and begin to put it in a healing environment.
Okay, so to answer my question, if they did want to back down off of those medications and they did it slowly, the brain would begin to increase in dopamine naturally again, if they do the right things.
Hopefully. But if it doesn't, go back on Wellbutrin.
Okay. Okay. So that was a good dopamine question. I like that. And do we have time for one more?
Let's do one more.
Okay. Let's see. I was curious if you've studied anyone with an autoimmune disease and if there was any correlation to the SPECT scan of individuals with autoimmune disease and symptom relief after your series of brain treatment and healing. There's just so many different types of autoimmune diseases.
And the question's from Sarah. So one of my favorite friends is a woman that has MS. And her brain was a mess.
Yeah.
And now it's much better.
Right.
And
She has everything.
Much better.
Right.
Right. She was headed for a wheelchair, and now she runs 3 times a week. So why is your immune system attacking itself? So for us, you want to get your gut healthy. You want to get rid of anything that could trigger the autoimmunity.
Yeah.
On SPECT scans, initially during an autoimmune disease, we see too much activity going on in the brain. But if it's chronic and it's been going on a long time, we usually see overall decrease activity.
So one thing that I would think would be really important is to really understand what's going on with whatever autoimmune issue you're having. For example, Hashimoto's you're going to feel different than if you have rheumatoid arthritis or MS. So I would want to understand what's behind the autoimmune issue. I don't know, do those show up differently? I would assume they show up differently in the brain, because thyroid, if you have low thyroid, that's going to be different.
You're going to have low blood flow.
Right. Then if you have something else going on, you may see something totally different.
In general, the first thing we see is inflammation,
with all of them?
Increased activity, except low thyroid.
Okay.
Chronically, though, we see that it hurts the brain.
Okay.
And you and I have seen, people who took the Brain Warriors Way program. If you don't know, we have an online program, 26 hours that Tana and I taught over 6 months. But if you go to amenuniversity.com, you can learn more about our online courses, including the Brain Warriors Way. We had so many people tell us they lost their pain.
Yeah.
There was this 20% reduction in pain, and fibromyalgia is an autoimmune disorder. All right.
And here's the thing. Nothing bad's going to happen to you by doing all the right things. so it's either going to help you a lot, or it's, going to help you a little, but it's not going to hurt you.
It's none of the things we recommend will ever hurt you.
Right.
All right. We're so grateful that you stayed with us for Driving Week. Please leave a review at Brain Warriors Way podcast or a comment.
Or on iTunes.
And we'll enter you into a drawing for a free copy of the cookbook. Also subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss any of these episodes. And please share it with a friend. Post something you learned today on one of your social media sites and hashtag Brain Warriors Way podcast.
Thank you. If you're enjoying the Brain Warriors Way podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll always know when there's a new episode. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or 5-star rating, as that helps others find the podcast.
If you're considering coming to Amen Clinics or trying some of the brain healthy supplements from BrainMD, you can use the code podcast10 to get a 10% discount on a full evaluation at amenclinics.com or a 10% discount on all supplements at brainmdhealth.com. For more information, give us a call at 855-978-1363.